Assalamu alaikum. So after seeing how we can create config maps in Kubernetes, in this video we will see how we can inject them to containers running inside pods in Kubernetes. So here we have a Redis config file that contains this data. We're going to use this file to create a config map, and then we will mount the config map to a Redis container running in Kubernetes. So first of all, let's create the config map using this Redis config file. So here we will use the kubectl create config map, and then we specify the name of the config map. For me, I will choose Redis config. And because we will create a config map using a file, here we will use the from file option, and we set it to the path to the file containing the data needed to create the config map. So here we will set the from file option to the path to the Redis config file. So let's press enter. Here Kubernetes tells us that the Redis config map successfully created. If we list the config maps that we have, so here we see the Redis config created 27 seconds ago. Let's verify that we have this data in this config map. So for that, I'm going to use the command kubectl get config map Redis config with the YAML option. So when we press enter, here we get the description of the config map in YAML format. So here we find the name of the config map, which is Redis config. And here we find the Redis config key, which is the name of this file. And the value set for this key is the content of the Redis config file. Okay. Now let's create a Redis pod and see how we can mount the config map that we have created as volume to the container running in this pod. So for that, here I will create a YAML file. I'm gonna call it Redis pod.yaml. Here we start with the API version, which is v1. Then the kind is pod. In the metadata section, we will specify the name of the pod. I'm gonna call it Redis pod. And in the spec section, here we will set the containers. So here we're gonna create a Redis container using the Redis image. And I will call this container Redis container. And what we will do now is to set the volume in the pod level. So here in the volumes section, we're gonna create a volume of type config map. Okay. So here we will create a volume of type config map. We're gonna call it config, and its type is config map. So here we have config map. Then in the config map section, here we have the name of the config map that we want to use for this volume, okay? Which is in our case Redis config. So Redis config is the name of the config map that we want to use for this volume. And then in the items section, here we will specify the keys that we want to fetch from this config map, okay? And in our case, in the config map that we have created, we have only one key, which is Redis config. So if we get the Redis config map, here we have only one key, okay? So here in the items section, we will tell Kubernetes that we want to fetch the data of the Redis config key. So here the key is Redis config. just here you have to know that here the Redis config is the name of the config map, okay? And here the Redis config is the name of a key stored in the config map, okay? So here we want to tell Kubernetes that we want to fetch the value of this key, which is Redis config, and put this data or this value in a redis.conf file, okay? So here we create a volume. The name of the volume is config. Its type is config map. The config map that we have used here is Redis config. So Redis config here is the name of the config map. And here we tell Kubernetes that we want to fetch the data of the key Redis config and put it in a redis.conf file. And the last thing that we have to do here is to mount this volume to the container. So here in the Redis container level, we will use the volume mounts property to mount this volume to the Redis container, okay? So here we have to set the mount path. Here I'm gonna, I will mount this volume to the path Redis master. So later we will see that we will find the redis.conf file in Redis master. And the volume that we want to mount here is the config volume that we have created here, okay? So now let's create the Redis pod using this YAML file. So here we will use the kubectl create -f, and then we give it the name of the YAML file, which is redispod.yaml. So here Kubernetes tells us that the pod is successfully created. So if we display the pods that we have, here we have only the Redis pod, and it is created 11 seconds ago. Now let's verify that we have the redis.conf file in Redis master in the Redis container. So for that, we're gonna use the kubectl exec command. And then we specify the name of the pod, which is Redis pod. And then we specify the command that we want to execute. Here I'm gonna list the file that we have in Redis master. Here we see that we have this redis.conf file. And if we check the content of this file using the cat command, so cat redismaster /redis.conf. So here we found the data that we have stored in the Redis config map, okay? So that's how we can mount a config map as a volume to a container running in a pod in Kubernetes. In the next video, we will see how we can use config maps to set environment variables for a container.